Thank you everyone for being here at the exceptional time of 1 p.m. Today we have Dr. John Kildea speaking to us. He is a co-director of the medical physics unit and an assistant professor at McGill University. And today he will be talking to us about looking back and forward. So please take it away, John.
Thanks, Pete. So I wasn't sure how much of an introduction I was going to get, so I just took the liberty of adding a few slides in from my career. So my background is in astrophysics. So I did work previously at telescopes in Arizona and in New Mexico. I've had the pleasure of working with many great mentors over the years, both in medical physics and in astrophysics. Some of them you will recognize here, some of them you may not. I've also had the pleasure of being a foreigner in a very, how should I put it, a secretive location in the United States where I had an escort and all sorts of security, but all goes with the job, I guess. So it's my pleasure to talk about medical physics, looking back and forward. I've really taken an approach here of trying to put medical physics into context. So it is really looking back first and then looking forward. These are my disclosures. I don't have any conflict of interest as such, but I do have a large grant with several companies in Quebec. So it's important that I highlight that as we get started. Okay, so what exactly am I going to talk about? Well, I'll start by looking back on the history of medical physics. Then I will try to define medical physics because I think a definition is important. And then I will look forward, look at some of the grand challenges that are in medical physics at the moment. I'll also mention a little bit about flash radiotherapy, and we've just had a great talk on flash radiotherapy in Dr. Freeman's honor, which I think is extremely fitting given Dr. Freeman's work over many years and in radiotherapy and this exciting future that we have ahead of us. And I'll also talk about the role of the NPU and how I see us moving forward. Okay, like any talk or any lecture, I guess, I've provided some learning objectives, but these are a little different. So some questions that you should be able to answer, and these might come in handy at a trivia quiz somewhere in the future. Not if you're answering them, because I doubt anyone would ask, but maybe you could put them on the questions if you're organizing the quiz. So which German Association of Research Institutes is named after a medical physicist? What is the historical thread linking McGill physics to flash radiotherapy? And I've really taken a lot of liberty here in making this connection. And what is the etymological relationship between physicians and physicists? And finally, what opportunity does Minister Dubé's 50-point plan to revamp the Quebec healthcare system offer medical physics? I'm not going to ask anybody to come up with the answers right now because I don't want you to steal my thunder, but I'll be interested at the end if anyone knows the answers to these already. Okay, a disclaimer to make. This talk will have lots of personal bias in it. I'm not attempting to cover comprehensively the history of medical physics or the future of medical physics. So please take it with that grain of salt. Okay, but physics and medicine are joined at the hip. That's an important take-home message. And also our profession has a rich and varied history. Current opportunities are plentiful, and I believe the future is bright. I hope you agree with me by the end. Okay, what sources of information have I used to put together this talk? Some information in The Lancet, Astro's Grand Challenges in Medical Physics, many other sources, but also this source, which might seem a little unusual, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And I hope as we get through the talk, you'll start to understand where I'm coming from with this. If you haven't read this book already, I really recommend it. It's a very accessible book. It's not, there is physics in it, but it's not a physics book. It's really, it's quite an enjoyable and very interesting read. Okay, looking back. So where did medical physics start? Well, many people say it started with Leonardo da Vinci. I'm not sure if you would be convinced of that, but if you're not, I suggest this nice editorial by Thomas Crome in Melbourne is something that you could read to be convinced. So Leonardo da Vinci was a polymath, someone who was interested in lots of things, and he studied physics without the S at the end. And I'm going to explain a little later what that means. And medical physics was around before Röntgen. We often hear and see that Röntgen was the source of medical physics, and we often think of it in those terms. But we had Leonardo da Vinci. We had also Galvani in Italy, who discovered bioelectricity. And we had Volta, who provided a chemical explanation for it. These were physicists working in the medical realm. But we also had Helmholtz, who invented the ophthalmoscope in 1851. And he was both a physicist and a physician. And he is the first answer to my questions at the start. The Helmholtz Association of Research Institutes, national labs in Germany, is named after him. And in fact, if you go on their website, they have this nice article about the development of the mRNA vaccine. And when I started reading this, I thought, okay, they're going to talk about BioNTech and how this works. And in fact, they talk about the DC particle accelerator in Hamburg, which was used to do small angle X-ray scattering and was used to understand the lipids that are used as the nanolipids that are used to encapsulate the mRNA in order to be able to bring it into the cells. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that physics has lots of uses in medicine, and much more than we often think about. But where things really changed was in 1895, when Röntgen discovered X-rays, discovered the ability for X-rays to pass through matter, through tissue, and to be able to produce images. And this was a revolutionary discovery for which Röntgen got the 1901 Nobel Prize. But very quickly afterwards, this was being used. And in fact, if you go onto the website of Diagnostic Radiology Department at McGill, you can see right away how they're talking about the use of X-rays just a few months later, 3 months later, in Montreal to do imaging. And this, in fact, was done by John Cox, who was the chief of physics in the physics department at McGill. The initial X-ray images were known as skygraphs or skygraphs, and the field was known as skyography. And I went on to Google, and I was able to access the first journal of skyography that was published in 1896. And it's actually really interesting. If you go look at it, you can see lots of the original images. So here's a dislocated elbow. But in the first journal, they were publishing images like this as well. So this is a lobster that they had imaged, and the images are quite good. I was very impressed that they were publishing this on paper and getting it out within 6 months of Röntgen's discovery. So initially it was known as the Journal of Skyography, and it then changed to the Journal of Radiology, and it's now part of the British Institute of Radiography publications. So the first use of radiation for treating cancer also happened in 1896, or at least the first one that I can find. There's many different histories on this. Different people claim different things, but this one is from the use of X-rays to treat a cancer patient in Lyon in 1896. And apparently it shrunk the tumor, but the patient died soon after. And as we know, the next big discovery was Becquerel discovering radioactivity, which was followed very closely by the work of Marie and Pierre Curie discovering polonium and radium, for which they received the Nobel Prize. Pierre Curie was killed in a street accident. He was run over by a horse-drawn cart in Paris soon afterwards. But Marie Curie continued and got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, which was the second prize for the Curies. The Curie family ultimately got 5 Nobel Prizes. But Marie Curie and Claudius Rigaud formed the Curie Foundation in Paris in 1920, which continues to this day for treating cancer. Now, what about our own history at McGill? Well, we know that Rutherford was I think he was a student at McGill. He didn't have a PhD at the time, but he discovered the half-life of radioactive sources. He discovered radon, alpha and beta radiation, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize for chemistry in 1908 after he had left McGill. And interestingly, the archives of the Röntgen ray, which were previously that journal that I showed you a few minutes ago, Rutherford, although he wasn't a clinician and he wasn't involved necessarily in medical physics, he did publish in that journal. And by accident, as I was going through it, I found this article that was published by Rutherford, in which he talks about half-life and what it means and how it works, which was quite interesting. So Rutherford became the director of the Cavendish Lab in Cambridge, which became a major source of physics research and medical physics research over the last 100 years. In 1929, Rutherford recruited a physicist known as Harold Gray. You can see here in this photograph, Rutherford is here at the front and Harold Gray is at the back. So Harold Gray joined initially to study cosmic ray physics under Rutherford, but then he ultimately moved into a hospital, the Mount Vernon Hospital in London, and ultimately formalized radiation dosimetry, discovered the cavity effect, and formalized what became known as the Bragg-Gray cavity theory. He also proposed the concept of the phantom, the relative biological effectiveness, the idea of calibrating instruments in radiotherapy, and the Gray Lab opened in 1953 as the first radiobiology institute in the world. And as you'll see in a bit, this place had major influence on radiobiology and medical physics. However, World War II was a major event, not only in the world in a social respect, but a major event for medical physics and physics in general. And there were two particular parts of World War II that are very interesting in this context. And as I mentioned at the start, that book on the building of the atomic bomb provides a lot of context on this. The first was the atomic bomb itself that was released over Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and also the discovery and the use of radar. So first of all, this is an interesting story that I always tell the class in health physics. And many people don't know this, but Montreal had a very important contribution to the building of the atomic bomb. And this started in France with Frédéric Joliot-Curie, who was the son-in-law of Marie Curie, who was working on the effort of the French to build an atomic bomb. And he had secured heavy water from a source in Norway, but France was very vulnerable to attack by the Germans. So they moved the heavy water, which was needed to build the bomb, they moved it to England, and the English started a project known as the Tube Alloys Project. That project also was vulnerable because they were afraid that the Germans might invade England. So they transferred the project to Montreal. They transferred it to McGill University in 1942. It started on Simpson Street, not too far from the Montreal General Hospital and near the Musée des Beaux-Arts. It ultimately moved to the University of Montreal under the tower at the University of Montreal, where the physics department at University of Montreal still is. And it was the physics experimental part was headed up by Pierre Auger, who we as physicists are all aware of the Auger effect, named after him, and also the large cosmic ray observatory in Argentina, named after him as well. This project moved to the University of Montreal in 1943. Here is a plaque, a photograph that I took off a plaque at the University of Montreal. You can see that if you go over beside the tower. And in 1943, the British, so this effort in Montreal to build an atomic bomb was a collaboration between the British, the French, and the Canadians. Ultimately, the British decided that they would join the Manhattan Project, and this was decided at a meeting between Mackenzie King, Roosevelt, and Churchill at Quebec City. You can see this photograph in 1943. So this put an end to the Montreal project for building the bomb, and the scientists joined the Manhattan Project, which ultimately did build the bomb and dropped it on Japan. But this effort led to the opening of the Chalk River laboratories in Ontario. And I think Richard Richardson, one of our collaborators, is on this call. Richard works at Chalk River. But very interestingly, William Maynard was part of the team. And for those of you in clinical medical physics, you know about the Maynard factor. So Maynard was a contemporary of Gray in London. And Maynard met Harold Johns while he was over here in Canada working on the project at Chalk River after the lab moved from Montreal to Chalk River. And Harold Johns, as we know, was a Canadian who made major contributions to medical physics in the years that followed. And I will talk a little bit about those in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk a little bit more. I want to elaborate a little more on the use of radar during World War II. And radar was needed in order to be able to see the airplanes that were dropping bombs, needed by the British in the UK, and they had a major effort, but also needed by the Americans. And the Americans had an effort as well. And in the US, the Varian brothers in California worked on a process to identify airplanes. So one of the Varian brothers was a pilot, and he had felt that pilots were vulnerable, especially in Latin America, if the Germans were to get there. So he got together with his brother, and the two of them built the Klystron, which allowed radar to be built effectively. And we know the story after this, that the Varian brothers, the use of the Klystron was used in radiotherapy Linacs. And we know that Varian Medical Systems was formed afterwards. The Varian brothers didn't have an interest per se in medicine. They were purely building this Klystron for radar purposes. Okay, I don't know if there's anybody else on the call from Ireland. But if you're from Ireland, the Varian name is actually very famous, and the Varians, their father was Irish. We're on a virtual call, but does anyone know what Varian does in Ireland? It's a really trivia question. I doubt I'm going to get any answers. So the Varian family is a well-known family in Ireland of Huguenot extraction from France. So they were Protestants in France who were chased out of France and came to Ireland, and they formed a company of paintbrushes and brushes, actually sweeping brushes as well. So if you talk about Varian in Ireland, this is what you would be talking about. But of course, we know that the family moved to the US and ultimately formed Varian Medical Systems. Okay, so back to Canada, and Harold Johns in 1945 was appointed at the University of Saskatchewan Department of Physics and the Saskatchewan Cancer Commission. And as part of this, he decided to try and get a Betatron, and he managed to get a Betatron, which was the first Betatron that was used to treat cancer in the world in Saskatoon. But ultimately, he went further, and he invented the cobalt teletherapy, which, as we know, cobalt 60 was being produced at the Chalk River labs where he had met Maynard. And we know that this was built in Saskatchewan. So Sylvia Fedoruk, there's a prize in the Canadian Organization of Medical Physicists named after her. She calibrated the first cobalt therapy machine. They published their paper in Nature. If you take a read of this Nature paper, you'll see that it cites John Trump. Who is John Trump? It turns out he is the uncle, or was the uncle, of Donald Trump. And he was a nuclear physicist in Harvard and did some work in the radiotherapy domain. And Harold Johns, of course, published the book, The Physics of Radiology, which for many years was considered an extremely important book for medical physics, and still is, in fact. And in 1956, Johns became the chief of physics at Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto. Jumping back a little bit, around the same time, the LINACs, so using the technology that had been invented by the Varian brothers, but also the other technology that had been invented in the United Kingdom. The first patients were treated with a LINAC at the Hammersmith Hospital in London. And then ultimately the first patient was treated with a LINAC at Stanford using the technology of Varian. And then the Varian officially had their first LINAC installed in UCLA. And this is a picture here of the first child with retinoblastoma that was treated with a LINAC. Okay, jumping ahead a little bit, I'd like to highlight a little the work of Erwin Podgorczak, who I hope, Erwin, I got these dates right, but Erwin moved to Toronto in 1973 to work with Harold Johns as a postdoc and as a clinical physicist, then moving to McGill later in the 70s. And then did great work at McGill over many years, leading the medical physics unit. And in particular, I'd like to highlight the work done on dynamic radiosurgery, which was really a major first in Canada and in the world for this type of technique. And here are some of the photos from this work. But McGill over the years has had many contributions to radiotherapy, and in particular in clinical radiotherapy and medical physics. It became the first CAMPEP accredited medical physics program in Canada, but also many major publications came out of McGill. The really great book on radiation physics by Erwin that we all use, also the book that Erwin edited with contributions from William, Michael, Horatio, many people at McGill. Jan contributed to this at IAEA, 2 books by Shirley Leonard, and multiple publications over the years from the clinical team at the MUHC under Erwin and Carolyn Freeman's leadership. And here's just a few of them that I'm highlighting. As I said at the start, this is by no way comprehensive, and I don't believe I'm covering everything, but I do want to highlight that there were a number of very important contributions in the clinical medical physics world that came out of McGill over the years. Another one that I would like to highlight is the work of Carl Otto, who was one of our MSc medical physics students. And Carl published this paper on volumetric modulated arc therapy, which now has become the standard of care in the treatment of patients with radiotherapy all over the world. And Carl was in the medical physics program between 1995 and 1997. Okay, so I've kind of moved into the realm of radiotherapy physics, but I do want to highlight that medical physics is much more than just radiotherapy, and it's also in imaging physics, but even more than that. And here's the work of J.J. Thomson, who was working in the Cavendish lab in the 1920s as well. He discovered mass spectrometry in the early days of radiation physics. And mass spectrometry is now an integral part of medicine, used in medical labs all over the world for genome sequencing and other identification of molecules. And Thomson discovered isotopes using the technique, but over the years it has been modified and changed. Another important contributor to medical physics and to medicine in general is Harold Hopkins, who was a physicist in the UK, and he was an optical physicist, worked with optics. So if you're in the field of astronomy, you would have heard of Hopkins, but also he worked on things like inventing the zoom lenses that are used on cameras, and he invented a laparoscope. So this is an endoscope, a rigid rod lens endoscope that can be used to image during surgery. And this allowed for keyhole surgery and the revolution that has happened in surgery over the last 30 years or so. So he started, this was pure physics work, and he met with someone who, a clinician who highlighted the problem in surgery, and ultimately they worked together to form or to create this endoscope. Okay. Many Nobel Prizes have been awarded to physicists and physicists in medicine. I'm just highlighting 8 or 9 of them here. I think we could look deeper and see that many of the contributions of physicists who have gotten Nobel Prizes are used in medicine today. Number 8 here is quite interesting, was Rutherford, who was a clinical medical physicist who got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995 for his work on nuclear non-proliferation. Okay, so that's a little bit on the history. Now, what is medical physics and how can we define it? And words do matter. So I've done a little bit of digging in the etymology of physics and medical physics. And it's interesting that both physicians and physicists start with the word phys or physic. And that's not a coincidence, in fact. So in Middle English and Middle French, the word physic stood for natural sciences and medicine. So both of these combined together meant physic. And at the time, there was no real distinction between natural sciences and medicine. Medicine was part of natural sciences. But ultimately, these two words, well, before I get there, physician was a person who studied natural sciences and medicine. And in English, it was physician, and in French, it was physicien. Ultimately, though, natural sciences and medicine got split apart in around the 1700s, and natural sciences became what we know now as physics, biology, chemistry, etc. And medicine became a field distinct on its own. And interestingly, in French, the word for somebody who studies medicine is médecin, but in English, it retained the word physician, whereas somebody who studies physics became known as a physicist. And in French, it was someone who studies physics is a physicien. So if, like me, you've ever been in a conversation in French and you say that you are a physicien, and you find that the other person you are talking to is confused and thinks that you are a physician or a médecin, this is the reason why. So these words are intimately linked, and I think it's very appropriate that physics and medicine go together, not just in the real world, but also etymologically. Okay, but what exactly is a medical physicist in today's world? Well, actually, the profession is defined by the International Standard Classification of Occupations. So you can go and look this up. And it turns out that physicists and astronomers are grouped together. But if you read the description, you can see that they apply their scientific knowledge relating to physics and astronomy in industrial, medical, military, and other fields. So medical physicists are grouped together with physicists and astronomers. And if you look at all the tasks, in fact, about half of the tasks that physicists and astronomers do is related to medicine. The safe and effective delivery of radiation, the accurate measurement in medical applications, medical treatment and dosimetry, etc. So physics, the definition of a physicist actually goes very well with medicine. What about in Quebec? So the Quebec Ministry of Health, I found it difficult to get a proper description of physicists, but there is a website, Avenir en Santé, that talks about all the positions in medicine. And you can see here, this is the description that the Quebec government provides about medicine, or sorry, medical physics. Which is interesting. It's not a very detailed description, but the Canadian Organization of Medical Physicists also defines what is known as a qualified medical physicist. And they provide this definition for the purpose of providing clinical professional services. Qualified medical physicist is an individual who is competent to independently provide clinical professional services in one or more of the subfields of medical physics, which are radiation oncology, nuclear medicine physics, diagnostic radiology physics, and magnetic resonance imaging, where the scope of practice is defined, and you can go and look that up on the Quebec, the COMP website. But what do medical physicists really do? What do we really do on a day-to-day basis? And I thought that this description by Benedict Frass, a physicist who received the Coolidge Award in 2013, I thought this description he provided in his acceptance speech was quite appropriate. He said the real reason there are medical physicists in a hospital is not so that they can calibrate machines, run QA tests and check charts. Our real job is to solve problems. The hospital needs us because we use and believe in the scientific method. We approach any problem with logic. We do well-designed experiments. We use careful data analysis and consider all the possibilities, not just the obvious. And hospitals don't have many people who can do this. I think this is a very important description of medical physicists, especially as we move into a new reality where a lot of tasks are becoming automated, a lot of things are changing, and in fact our profession may be changing. I think it's important to remember what we're really doing, and that is we're modeling the world and we're solving problems. And I think this is a nice way to describe it. What do we do on a day-to-day basis? Well, problem solving and modeling, as I just said. The domains where we're involved in medical practice include medical imaging, radiation oncology, radiation protection, radiation biology, information technology, biomedical engineering, technology development, and digital medicine. And this is a more modern look at things. So the traditional areas are here on the right, and the more recent areas are here on the left. So with that said, where are we going with all this? So where is medical physics going? And again, this is my my personal look at things, but I've looked and read some of the literature around this, and many people have been thinking about this. So there's this nice article in Astro, or coming from a workshop at Astro. I think it was in 2019. This was published in the Green Journal in 2020, Grand Challenges for Medical Physics in Radiation Oncology. And these are the 4 grand challenges that were identified. Number 1, improving target volume definition. Number 2, adoption of AI and automation. Number 3, developing the predictive models of biological effects for precision medicine. And number 4, the need for leadership. So I'll just go through each of these quickly. First of all, challenge number 1, improving the target volume definition. This is quite interesting because the paper talks about the clinical target volume being an art. So we know that the gross target volume is what can be seen or palpated in terms of the tumor. We know that the clinical target volume is the area around the GTV that is invisible, but it is delineated based on the clinicians or the physicians' knowledge and experience, and the knowledge about the patient and the knowledge about other patients, and essentially medical knowledge in general. But it is a skill that is acquired by experience, study, or observation. That's art, as defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And they make a good point, and I thought about this a little bit. In fact, we see this ourselves. So this is a paper that Haley Patrick led publication of with Dr. Suhami and myself a few years ago, where we looked at the CTV in prostate cancer and the pelvic lymph node CTV in effect. And we saw that for different radiation oncologists, there was a different definition and a different way of delineating it. And this is very interesting because it does show that there's a lot of subjectivity in the clinical target volume, and there's a lot of room for being able to predict this. So at a very basic level, there's some human behavior here, and that we could predict human behavior. We did have an intervention where we brought this to the attention of our physicians, and there was some change in practice after the intervention that we were able to see, and we were able to publish on this. So how can medical physics help in this? This is a domain that is really clinical, but there is a lot of work now with data science that we could start to make use of. And in particular, we could start to incorporate additional imaging and biomarker data. If we were able to share data to get more data to be able to see what is happening, we would start to be able to make predictions. And this really is highlighting a lot of the way, a lot of the direction in which medical physics is moving to be able to use data for predictions. So this could be very interesting, but it's not just based on the images, as we know, and our clinician colleagues could tell us that very clearly. But there are tumor spread pathways, and there's knowledge that can be or that is incorporated into this delineation. But this can also be modeled. And here's a very nice paper that I found by Newton, who is a physicist in California, looking at, this is for metastasis, so it's not for local spread, but for the spread of metastatic breast cancer for different diagnoses. You can see that it can actually be modeled probabilistically where the metastasis will spread. And we know that as medical physicists, dealing with probability is something that we work with all the time. So a possible solution to being able to predict clinical target volumes might be to work with Monte Carlo modeling and to do digital twinning. So I think this is an area where I think Astro got it right, that there is a role for physics in defining the clinical target volume as we move forward. Challenge number 2 identified by Astro was the adoption of AI and automation into the clinic. And this is a real challenge that is coming very, very fast. So a lot of new technologies now. We know it ourselves with image registration and auto contouring, that this sort of AI type work is now being incorporated into clinical radiotherapy and clinical physics all the time. But we need to treat it like any other technology that we work with in medical physics. We need to do our acceptance tests, our commissioning, QA, calibration, etc., so that we can bring in these automated tools correctly, following the principles that we already know and use. So it's also important that we collaborate in the development. So as medical physicists, there's a lot that we can provide, but we need to work with our clinical colleagues to see what are the clinical questions, and then to take leadership in implementing the solutions. So with all the work that has been done around the automation, but of course it requires good, high quality and lots of data. And this is something I think where in general we are not doing that good at. And there's a lot of room to improve data quality and the amount of data that we're collecting. And there's room to educate ourselves in our training programs on how AI and automation will be used clinically going forward. Okay, so challenge number 3 was the development of predictive models. And I'm highlighting here the role of Douglas Lee and Tikva Alper, who were 2 physicists working with Harold Gray in the UK. This is a great book by Tikva Alper, one of the early texts on cellular radiobiology. And between the 2 of them, they came up with the model on single hit and double hit targets for cell survival curves, which are still being used. And this is a paper published by Stephen McMahon in Belfast in 2019. These are still very important, this model. And Tikva Alper also discovered the concept of indirect action on DNA damage by radiation. We also, in our own clinic have been involved in predictive modeling, and this is a really nice paper by Brenda Clark, working with Louis Sohami and Irvin Podgorczak on the use of the integral effective dose to predict brainstem toxicity in hyperfractionated stereotactic radiotherapy. So I'm just highlighting this as an example of physicists being involved in the development of predictive models in the past. But there's great opportunities in moving into the future, because we look here at the work of the Quantech group. You can see here that about half the people on this introductory paper of Quantech were medical physicists and clinical physicists, in fact, who are working and providing this paper. And now we know today that we're moving away from just simple biological models, predictive models, to being able to use multiple data. And this is an image from a paper by Issam Al-Naka, who was one of our former colleagues, on how we can use all the different data that we have available to us, if we have those data available to us, to be able to make predictions. But it's not so simple. So making predictive models is not trivial. We have the skills to do it, but we know that radiation therapy is not delivered alone. It's delivered with chemotherapy, with targeted therapy, with immunotherapy, etc. All of these now need to be brought into the picture and used to produce our predictive models. So I'm making the case here that there's a strong case for multidisciplinarity in future medical physics. We, as medical physicists, we have the skills to do this, the skills to do these multi-parameter models, but we need to take leadership. We need to be involved in clinical trial design, and we need to avoid this black box syndrome of just producing a model where we get a question, we put it into our black box and we get an answer out. That is not going to help to advance the field. That will help us to move forward a little bit, but ultimately it won't work. So we need to be careful and avoid this. Leadership. So challenge number 4 by Astro was leadership. So for medical physicists, radiation oncology is changing. We as medical physicists have unique skills to lead in various domains, but we need to do it carefully, and we shouldn't do it blindly. And here I'm just highlighting that from this paper by Farino et al, how we can see that how that the target has really changed over the last number of years, from the 90s up until where we are today. So where we had a margin around the PT, or around the CTV, that was quite large, but also we had a treated field that was even much larger, how that became conformal, and then with IMRT it became even more conformal, and now with IMRT, IGRT, and VMAT, we're able to get very tight conformality on the target. But we need to be careful. If the target is incorrect, and we were looking at the CTV earlier, if the target is incorrect, then our highly conformal treatments are hitting the wrong thing. But also we've got all these developments now with image-guided radiotherapy, etc. And we're not necessarily reducing our target volumes. So are we going into this work of changing all our technologies? Are we going in there blindly? And I think there's a room here for medical physics to really have a look at this and to make sure that we're reducing our target volumes in conjunction with the improvements in imaging that we're doing, etc. So not just to take technology and put it into the clinic and do so blindly. So those were the 4 grand challenges for medical physics in radiation oncology that Astro highlighted. And as you can see, a lot of them are computationally related. And the question you might ask is all this computer stuff really medical physics? And first of all, I go back to this quote by Benedict Frass, where as physicists, we're not tied to radiation per se, but we're involved in applying the scientific method and logic. So our skills do come in handy in this computational domain as well. And this is a figure that I drew up for a meeting in Vienna a few years ago. And this is the reality of medical physicists in the clinic. The medical physics department takes care of information technology at a very high level. So whether it is looking after PACS systems or record and verify, whether it is looking at selection of vendors for all the different IT systems, all the interfaces with the systems in the hospital for data sharing, the research and development that we're doing, the data management on a day-to-day basis, and the database reporting to the system administration, this is taken care of by medical physics. So whether we like it or not, we are heavily involved in the computational aspects of medical physics, of medicine, in fact. So there's nothing wrong with that. And it is physics as well. And this is a picture of Tim Berners-Lee, who was a physicist working at CERN in the late 80s. And he was the inventor of the World Wide Web, which we know we're using every day and is part of our lives. But he's also been working recently on a new version of the World Wide Web, and he's calling this technology now solid. And the idea of solid is that everybody should have their own data and have control over their own data. And I do think that there's a role for this in medicine in the future, a role for where we could imagine a future of medicine where, as individuals, we have full access and control over our own healthcare data. And this is something I really believe in, and that I'm working through the OPAL project, working on this to advance the idea of patients having full access and control of their health data. But I will move forward, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. How do we improve radiotherapy? So we had just got a nice talk earlier today from Professor Putmans, who talked about flash radiotherapy. And you can see here, these are the curves, the dose response curves, where we have our normal tissue complication probability and our our tumor control probability. And we want to keep we want to increase the tumor control probability while keeping the normal tissue control probability low. Here's all the strategies that we have, whether it's fractionation or our target definition, as I was just showing, our dose gradient, radiosensitizers, immunotherapy, and the abscopal effect. These are emerging areas of interest, and also flash radiotherapy that Dr. Putmans was presenting. And I'll just talk about this for a minute. So we just got a nice presentation of flash and the future of flash, and I would like to just step back a little bit and look about where the idea of flash came from. And in fact, it started in the lab of Harold Gray, and it was this physicist, Dewey, who published a paper on the use of radiation to kill bacteria. And they were investigating the oxygen enhancement effect, in fact. And what they were doing is that they were using a normal dose rate and an ultra high dose rate. And they saw that bacteria that were oxygenated were obviously more radiosensitive and died. And those that were in pure nitrogen were less radiosensitive. But what they found out is when they used an ultra high dose rate, that the bacteria in the oxygen became less radiosensitive, somewhat equivalently to those bacteria that were not oxygenated at all. So they realized that they were onto something, and they published this. Of course, this was confirmed by other groups throughout the years, but it was really only in 2017 when this was used to treat mice. And not only they discovered that healthy cells, like the bacteria, were less radiosensitive when exposed to a very high dose rate, but they discovered that the tumor was more radiosensitive. And this is where the idea of flash radiotherapy came about. And if we go back to my early questions on the link between Flash and McGill, well, the connection is that Rutherford worked at McGill. He moved to the Cavendish laboratory. He hired Hal Gray, who ultimately created the Gray lab, and Dewey discovered the flash effect in the Gray lab. As I told you, it was a very tenuous historical connection, but there you go. This is the paper that was published in 2017, showing how the mice who had been exposed to the flash effect actually not only had less normal tissue complication, but they had more tumor control probability as well. And then the first patient who was treated in 2019, the publication that came out. So what about the future? So here's a very optimistic view of the future of radiation therapy and medical physics. So let's imagine low-cost containerized radiotherapy clinics. And this is an idea that David Jaffrey, who was previously the head of medical physics at Princess Margaret Hospital, mentioned to me a few years ago. The idea of putting compact radiotherapy linacs in containers, putting these off into remote locations. We could imagine putting one of these in Abitibi or in the far north or in developing countries, where we install these robust linear accelerators with CT scanners. They're fully automated QA, so everything is done remotely. I'm not quite sure if Flash could work, but let's imagine in an optimistic future it could. And we deploy these where we need them. And then back to the concept of giving patients full access to their medical data, you could imagine where patients could move around and take their medical data with them and get treated close to home, which would be ideal for patients that are coming from very far distances. So obviously the clinical consultations, some of them would need to be in person, but we know with COVID that a lot of them can take place remotely. It's a very optimistic view of things. There's a lot of work to be done, but you could imagine in 10 or 20 years that we might start approaching this, unless flash radiotherapy becomes such a thing that we need to have huge facilities once again to be able to deliver radiotherapy. Okay. What are the implications for all this for medical physics training? Well, we need to include better or more concepts in our curriculum about imaging, computational methods, biological modeling, leadership, so that our physicists can come out having skills in management and communication. But we need to not forget the basic physics behind all this. So I think these are all the principles that we know, that we already work with. But there are reasons to include these at a more in-depth level in our physics curricula as we're moving forward, while not losing sight of the basic medical physics. And medical or physics shouldn't just be part of a medical physics curriculum. Physics should be part of a medical curriculum. And in fact, this is a paper from 1923 highlighting the importance of physics in medical curricula. And I think in the UK, this physics was not part of medical curricula for many years, but there was a campaign to bring it back in, and I believe it is again. I'm not quite sure how it fits in directly in Canada. I know that we do provide at advanced levels physics training, but even at early levels, physics should be included. I promised to look at the Quebec government's 50-point plan and see what the implications are for medical physics. So this was published just about a month or two ago, the 50-point plan to improve healthcare. There's two areas that I saw of interest. First of all, the government is proposing to make the quality of life and the conditions for healthcare personnel better. Now, if you read through this article was really published for the public and not, there's a lot of hype in it. But when the government says things like this, it does provide an opening to make sure that in the next entente, the next collective agreement for medical physicists, that there is reference made to this publication and to hold the government to what they said. Also, interestingly, this publication by the Quebec Ministry of Health makes reference to research, which, as we know, for many years, research has not been in the spotlight for the Ministry of Health. But I think with COVID, they're starting to realize that research has an important role. And again, we have to hold them to this. So what they say in this document, we should hold them to it as we move forward. Okay, what about the MPU? So I've talked about the history of medical physics. I've talked about the definition of medical physics, where some of the areas that medical physics will be going in the radiotherapy world. I haven't covered anything to do with imaging, but where does the MPU fit into all this? So where do I see the MPU fitting into all this? Well, we have the medical physics unit. We are the center of our own world, of course, but we're not the center of everybody else's world. We do have colleagues, multidisciplinary colleagues in many areas of clinical medicine, research, academia, that we are working with all the time. Nobody is an island in medicine anymore. We all need to work together in order to be able to achieve our own goals, because nobody's goals are individual in the healthcare system and in medicine. And here you can see some of the links of the McGill Medical Physics Unit with oncology, with the research institutes at the Jewish and at the MUHC, with our clinical colleagues and with our academic colleagues in physics and BME and in computer science. It's important that we're mindful also that all of our colleagues do have stakeholders of their own, not just medical physics. So we have to be mindful that as we try to get collaboration, everybody has their own pain points, and that we need to work together. But I think if we can all work together, we can achieve something that is greater than any of us individually. And this is like, if you've done mountaineering, where you're climbing a mountain, we're all tied together so that if one of us falls, the others will be able to break and hold us. But also it means that none of us can race forward and be the first to climb the mountain, because we need, if we really want to have that stability, we need to have our colleagues with us. So as the medical physics unit, as we advance and we try to advance, we need to make sure that we do it in an ecosystem approach where everybody is advancing, and we will all get there together. So my vision for the medical physics unit is really a world-leading medical physics unit in a world-leading radiation medicine ecosystem. So this ecosystem, I think, is vitally important. And how do we achieve this? Well, we need to have a mission that is to work to attract the top trainees into medical physics, as in the other areas of medicine, and work to attract the top medical physicists into our clinical world and into our academic world. And it's only if we're able to achieve this mission that we can say that we are world leading. Because when we advertise positions for medical physicists, whether clinical or academic, we should be having the best people in the world coming here to work with us, because we're such a great place to work at. And the same for our trainees, that are students coming out of physics or out of undergraduate are coming to study with us, because it's such a great place to study. So as we make decisions in the future on how we move forward, we need to ask ourselves, do we enjoy what we do? Is this, whatever change it is, whatever decision we're making, does it help us to really enjoy what we're doing even more? Are we proud of what we're doing? Are we, do we have each other's backs? Are we working together in a multidisciplinary approach? Do we have visibility? Do we give credit to people when they do great work? Do we get the word out there at conferences, etc.? So it's very important to build our reputation, to make sure we are a great place to work, that we're all enjoying our work. And ultimately, we want to change practice, because as physicists in medicine, our greatest goal is to improve medicine through our work. And I think that is true of clinical physicists and academic physicists. So if we can achieve these things, we will be a great place. And if we're a great place, then the best people will come and join our team. And this is my last slide. So we are the medical physics unit, and this is an inside joke for our medical physicists, but our alumni are all over the world. We're scattered, but we remain tightly bonded. So thank you.